The sound of a woman's desperate sobs cut through the quiet morning air like a knife, stopping Jacob Sawyer dead in his tracks as he rode along the dusty trail just outside Cody, Wyoming Territory. It was late August in 1883, and the sun was barely cresting over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that should have been beautiful, but felt strangely ominous given the heartbreaking sound echoing through the valley. Jacob pulled his mare to a halt, his weathered hand moving instinctively to the rifle at his side before he thought better of it. Whatever had caused such anguish likely wasn't something he could shoot his way through. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, coming back from a cattle drive that had taken him clear across to Montana Territory. At 32 years old, Jacob had spent more than half his life on the range, sleeping under stars and eating dust. He'd learned early on that the best policy was usually to mind your own business, especially when it came to other people's troubles. But something about those sobs, raw and broken, pulled at something deep inside his chest that he'd thought had died years ago. Dismounting slowly, Jacob tied his horse to a scraggly pine and moved cautiously toward the sound. The trail here wound through a copse of cottonwoods that followed a small creek, providing some shade from what promised to be another scorching day. As he rounded a large boulder, he saw her. She was crumpled on the ground like a discarded doll, her dress torn and dirty, dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. From what he could see, she was young, maybe in her early 20s, and completely alone. No horse, no wagon, no supplies that he could spot. Just a woman in the middle of nowhere, sobbing like her heart had been ripped clean out of her chest. Jacob cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her. "Madam, you hurt." The woman's head snapped up, and Jacob found himself looking into the reddest, most tear-stained eyes he'd ever seen. They were green, he noted absently, a deep forest green that would probably be striking when she wasn't crying. Fear flashed across her face, and she scrambled backward, her back hitting the boulder behind her. "I don't mean you any harm," Jacob said quickly, holding his hands up where she could see them. "Just heard you crying and wanted to make sure you were all right, though I reckon you're not, given the circumstances." The woman stared at him for a long moment, her breath coming in sharp gasps as if she couldn't quite get enough air. Then, to his surprise, she laughed. It was a bitter, broken sound that somehow made him feel worse than the crying had. "All right," she repeated, her voice hoarse. "No, I'm not all right. I'm about as far from all right as a person can get." Jacob waited, not pushing. He'd learned that patience was often the best tool when dealing with frightened creatures, and this woman looked about as frightened as they came. After a moment, he slowly lowered himself to sit on a nearby rock, making himself less threatening by getting down to her level. "You got a name?" he asked gently. "Grace," she whispered. "Grace Campbell." "Well, Miss Campbell, I'm Jacob Sawyer. I work on a ranch about 10 miles from here, just outside Cody. You want to tell me how you ended up out here all alone?" Grace's face crumpled again, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "My husband," she started, then stopped, shaking her head. "No, he wasn't my husband. We were supposed to get married when we reached Cody. Thomas Coleman. We were traveling from Ohio with a wagon train, but 2 days ago we had a disagreement. He said I was too demanding, too difficult. Said he'd made a mistake asking me to come west with him." Jacob felt his jaw tighten. He'd known plenty of men like that in his time, men who made promises they had no intention of keeping once the reality of those promises became inconvenient. "He left you here. He took the wagon and kept going," Grace said, her voice small. "Just left me on the trail. I had a small bag with some of my things, but someone stole it yesterday while I was sleeping. I don't have anything now. No money, no food, no way to get anywhere. I've been walking, but I don't even know which direction to go." I thought maybe I could make it to the next town, but I'm so tired and hungry, and I just couldn't go any further." The despair in her voice was palpable, and Jacob felt something fierce rise up in his chest. He'd seen a lot of cruelty in his years out west, but abandoning a woman with nothing in the middle of nowhere was about as low as a man could sink. "When did you last eat?" he asked. Grace had to think about it, which told him everything he needed to know. "2 days ago, I think. Maybe 3. The days are blurring together. Jacob stood up, moving slowly so as not to alarm her. "Well, that's something I can fix right now. I've got supplies on my horse, nothing fancy, but it'll fill your belly." He walked back to where his mare was tied and retrieved his saddlebag, pulling out some jerky, hardtack, and a canteen of water. When he returned to Grace, she was watching him with a mixture of hope and wariness that made his heart ache. "Here," he said, crouching down and offering her the food. "Go slow. If you haven't eaten in days, you'll make yourself sick if you eat too fast." Grace took the jerky with trembling hands, and Jacob watched as she forced herself to take small bites despite what must have been overwhelming hunger. He offered her the canteen, and she drank carefully, following his advice. "Thank you," she whispered when she'd taken the edge off her hunger. "You're very kind." Jacob shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just doing what any decent person would do." "Thomas didn't," Grace said quietly. "And we were supposed to love each other. You're a complete stranger, and you've shown me more kindness in 10 minutes than he did in our last week together." They sat in silence for a while as Grace ate, the morning growing warmer around them. Jacob found himself studying her more carefully now that she seemed calmer. Even dirty and tear-stained, he could see that she was beautiful, but more than that. There was something in her bearing that spoke of strength beneath the current despair. Her hands, though soft, had calluses that suggested she wasn't afraid of work. Her dress, though torn, had been well made and carefully maintained. "What are you going to do now?" Grace asked finally, and Jacob realized she was asking what he planned to do with her. It was a fair question. Out here, a lone woman had few options, and most of them weren't good. He could take her to Cody and leave her there, but with no money and no connections, she'd likely end up in one of the saloons working as a dancer or worse. He could take her to the nearest marshal, but what crime had been committed? Being a worthless coward wasn't against the law, unfortunately. Or he could do what his gut was telling him to do, even though his head was screaming that it was a terrible idea. "The ranch where I work is owned by a man named Henry Morrison," Jacob said slowly, thinking it through as he spoke. "His wife Alina runs the house, and they've got a daughter about your age named Sarah. They're good people, God-fearing and fair. The house is big, and Alina's been saying for months that she needs help with the cooking and cleaning, especially now that Sarah's expecting her first baby." Grace's eyes widened. "You'd take me there. But they don't know me. Why would they take in a complete stranger?" "Because that's the kind of people they are," Jacob said simply. "Can't promise they'll say yes, but I know Alina's been struggling with all the work, and Henry would trust my judgment on your character." "You don't know my character," Grace pointed out, and Jacob was pleased to hear a hint of spirit returning to her voice. "I could be a thief or a con artist." Jacob smiled for the first time since finding her. "Could be, I suppose, but I don't think so. I've gotten pretty good at reading people over the years, and you've got honest eyes. Besides, if you were a con artist, you probably wouldn't have ended up alone and starving on a trail." Grace looked down at her hands, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say. After Thomas left me, I thought I was going to die out here. I couldn't see any way forward, and now you're offering me a chance at life again, at a purpose. I don't deserve such kindness." "Everyone deserves kindness," Jacob said firmly. and everyone deserves a second chance. Now can you ride? It's 10 miles to the ranch and walking it in your condition isn't a good idea, Grace nodded. I can ride. My father had horses back in Ohio. I'm not an expert, but I can manage. Good enough, Jacob said, standing and offering her his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Grace took it and he pulled her to her feet. She swayed slightly and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. Easy now. You're still weak from lack of food. They made their way back to where Jacob's mare was tied, and he helped Grace mount up before swinging up behind her. She stiffened at first at the proximity, and he couldn't blame her. After what she'd been through, trusting any man probably felt impossible. But as they started riding, she gradually relaxed, her exhaustion taking over. The ride to the Morrison Ranch took about 2 hours, and by the time they arrived, Grace had actually fallen asleep, leaning back against Jacob's chest. He found himself acutely aware of her presence, the weight of her against him, the scent of her hair beneath the dust and sweat. It had been a long time since he'd been this close to a woman, and longer still since he'd felt this strange protective instinct toward anyone. The Morrison Ranch was a sprawling operation with a main house, several outbuildings, a large barn, and extensive corrals. Henry Morrison ran about 2,000 head of cattle and employed 15 men year-round, with more brought on during busy seasons. Jacob had been working there for 7 years, ever since he drifted into Wyoming Territory looking for a fresh start after his own failed engagement back in Texas. Henry had given him a job when he desperately needed one, and Jacob had been loyal ever since. As they rode into the yard, several of the ranch hands looked up with curiosity, their eyes widening at the sight of Jacob with a woman. He ignored them, riding straight up to the main house and dismounting carefully so as not to disturb Grace too much. When his boots hit the ground, she woke with a start, confusion clouding her face before memory returned. "We're here," Jacob said gently, reaching up to help her down. "Just let me do the talking, all right," Grace nodded, allowing him to lift her from the horse. She stood unsteadily, and he kept a supportive hand on her arm as they approached the front door. Before he could knock, it swung open, and Eleanor Morrison stood there, her kind face creased with concern. Eleanor was in her mid-50s, with gray streaked brown hair pulled back in a neat bun and flour dusting her apron. She looked from Jacob to Grace and back again, her eyes taking in Grace's bedraggled appearance and obvious exhaustion. "Jacob Sawyer, what on earth?" Eleanor said, but her tone was more curious than accusatory. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Miss Grace Campbell," Jacob said. "I found her on the trail this morning. She was abandoned there by a man who'd promised to marry her, left without food or supplies for 3 days. I know you've been saying you needed help around the house, and I thought maybe we could work something out." Eleanor's expression shifted from concern to something harder, anger flashing in her eyes at the mention of Grace's abandonment. But when she looked at Grace, her face softened immediately into maternal compassion. "You poor dear," she said, reaching out to take Grace's hand. "Come inside right now. You look like you're about to collapse. Jacob, go find Henry and tell him what's happened, then get back to work. I'll handle things here." Jacob felt oddly reluctant to leave Grace, which was strange considering he'd only known her for a few hours. But Eleanor was already ushering her inside, and he knew Grace was in good hands. He tipped his hat and headed toward the barn where he'd spotted Henry earlier. Henry Morrison was a tall, solidly built man in his late 50s with a weathered face and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He was checking on a mare that had foaled the night before when Jacob found him. "Jacob, you're back," Henry said, looking up with a smile. "Drive go well." "Yes, sir," Jacob replied. "Got the full payment from the buyer in Montana, and the herd arrived in good shape, but I need to talk to you about something else." He explained the situation with grace, keeping to the facts and trying not to let his own feelings color the telling. Henry listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker when Jacob described how she'd been abandoned. "A man who do that isn't worth the air he breathes," Henry said flatly when Jacob finished. "And you did right bringing her here. Alina's been running herself ragged trying to keep up with everything, especially with Sarah's pregnancy making her sick half the time. If this girl is willing to work, we can certainly use the help." "I think she'll work hard," Jacob said. "She's had a rough time, but I get the sense she's made of strong stuff underneath." Henry gave him a long, appraising look. "You like her." It wasn't a question, but Jacob felt heat creep up his neck anyway. "I barely know her." "Sometimes that's all it takes," Henry said with a knowing smile. "I knew I was going to marry Alina about 10 minutes after meeting her. Took me 3 months to convince her of it, but I knew." Jacob didn't know what to say to that, so he changed the subject. "I should get cleaned up and check in with the other men, see what needs doing." "Fair enough," Henry agreed. "But Jacob, keep an eye on that girl. She's been through a trauma, and sometimes people don't show the full effects of that right away. She might need a friend." Over the following days, Jacob found his thoughts returning to Grace more often than he would have expected. He didn't see much of her at first, because she was spending most of her time in the house learning her duties from Alina and recovering her strength. But occasionally he'd catch glimpses of her through the kitchen window or hanging laundry in the yard, and each time he felt that same strange pull in his chest. About a week after he'd brought her to the ranch, Jacob was coming back from checking fence lines in the north pasture when he saw Grace sitting on the front porch, shelling peas into a large bowl. She looked different from that first morning. Her hair was clean and neatly braided, her face had lost some of its gauntness, and she was wearing a simple blue dress that Alina must have given her. But more than the physical changes, there was something different in her bearing. She held herself straighter, moved with more purpose. As if sensing his gaze, Grace looked up and their eyes met. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the distance of the yard. Then Grace smiled, a real smile that transformed her face and raised her hand in a small wave. Jacob felt his heart do something strange in his chest, and he found himself dismounting and leading his horse over to the porch. "Miss Campbell," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "you're looking well." "Thanks to you," Grace replied, her smile softening into something more intimate. "I never properly thanked you, Mr. Sawyer. You saved my life that day on the trail. If you hadn't come along when you did, I don't know what would have happened to me." Jacob shifted his weight, uncomfortable with her gratitude even as it warmed him. "Just Jacob is fine. And like I said, any decent person would have done the same. But you're the one who did it," Grace insisted. "And you're the one who brought me here and convinced the Morrisons to give me a chance. Mrs. Morrison told me you vouched for my character even though you didn't know me at all. That took trust, and I won't forget it." "How are you settling in?" Jacob asked, wanting to shift the focus away from himself. Grace's face brightened even more. "It's wonderful here. Mrs. Morrison and Sarah are so kind and the work keeps me busy. I feel useful again, like I have a purpose. For a while there, after Thomas left me, I felt like I was nothing, like I had no worth at all. But here, every day I can see the results of my labor. The meals I prepare, the clean floors, the mended clothes. It might not sound like much, but it matters to me." The passion in her voice touched something deep inside Jacob. He understood that need for purpose, that desire to matter to someone or something. It was part of what had drawn him to ranch work, the satisfaction of seeing tangible results from hard labor. "It's not nothing," he said firmly. "Running a household this size is important work. The ranch couldn't function without it." They talked for a while longer, the conversation flowing easily between them. Jacob found himself sharing things he rarely spoke about: his childhood in Texas, his parents who had died of fever when he was 17, his years of drifting before finding his place here. Grace shared bits of her own story too, how she'd grown up in Cincinnati, the youngest of 4 daughters. Her father had been a shopkeeper, her mother a teacher. She'd met Thomas at a church social, been swept up in his grand plans for starting fresh in the West, convinced herself she was in love with him. "I think I was more in love with the idea of adventure than with him," Grace admitted. "When he started showing his true colors during the journey, I told myself it was just the stress of travel. But looking back, the signs were there all along. He was charming when things were going his way, but the moment anything got difficult, he turned cruel. I should have seen it sooner." "You can't blame yourself for wanting to believe the best in someone," Jacob said. "That speaks to your character, not his." Grace looked at him with such warmth in her eyes that Jacob felt his breath catch. "You're a good man, Jacob Sawyer. I mean that." Before he could respond, Sarah Morrison came out onto the porch, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "Grace, Mother needs help with dinner," she said, then noticed Jacob and smiled. "Oh, hello, Jacob. How are you?" "Just fine, Miss Sarah," Jacob replied, then nodded to both women and led his horse toward the barn, very aware of Grace's eyes following him. As summer turned to fall, Jacob and Grace's friendship deepened. They fell into a pattern of stolen conversations whenever their paths crossed during the day, brief moments that Jacob found himself looking forward to with an intensity that both excited and frightened him. He'd been hurt before, badly enough that he'd sworn off serious romantic entanglements. But Grace was different somehow. She'd been broken too, and maybe that made her understand him in a way others couldn't. One evening in late September, Jacob was sitting on the corral fence watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple when Grace appeared beside him, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. "I thought you might like some," she said, offering him one of the cups. "I noticed you usually come out here after dinner." Jacob took the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm tin cup. "It's the best time of day. Everything's quiet, the work is done, and you can just breathe." Grace climbed up to sit beside him on the fence, balancing carefully with her coffee. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "So different from Ohio. There, everything was crowded and close. Here, you can see for miles. It makes you feel both small and infinite at the same time." "That's a good way of putting it," Jacob agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their coffee and watching the light fade. Then Jacob found himself speaking without really meaning to. "I was engaged once back in Texas. Her name was Catherine. We'd known each other since we were children, and everyone always assumed we'd end up together. I loved her, or I thought I did. But a few months before the wedding, I found out she'd been seeing someone else, a banker from Dallas, someone with better prospects than a cowhand." Grace turned to look at him, her expression sympathetic but not pitying. "What did you do?" "Called off the wedding and left town," Jacob said with a bitter laugh. "Felt like staying would be like admitting defeat. So I drifted for a few years, working different ranches, never staying anywhere long, until I came here and Henry offered me something permanent. I've been here 7 years now, and it's the closest thing to home I've had since I left Texas." "You still think about her?" Grace asked quietly. Jacob considered the question. "Sometimes, but not in the way I used to. Mostly I'm just grateful things ended when they did before we were married and had children. Would have been a lot messier then." He looked at Grace, meeting her eyes in the fading light. "What about you?" "Do you think about Thomas?" Grace shook her head firmly. "Not if I can help it. And when I do, I'm mostly angry. Angry at him for being such a coward, but angrier at myself for not seeing it sooner. I wasted so much time on someone who didn't deserve it." She paused, then added softly, "But if he hadn't left me on that trail, I never would have ended up here, never would have met you, so maybe it all happened the way it was supposed to." The weight of those words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jacob's heart was pounding, and he knew he stood at a crossroads. He could let the moment pass, keep things safe and distant between them, or he could take a risk, open himself up to the possibility of being hurt again. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something, and I don't want you to feel obligated to respond in any particular way. If you want to forget I said anything after, that's fine. But I've got to say it because it's been eating at me for weeks now." Grace set down her coffee cup, giving him her full attention. "What is it?" "I think I'm falling in love with you," Jacob said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know it's probably too soon, and I know you've been through hell and probably aren't interested in any man right now, but I can't stop thinking about you. Every morning I wake up looking forward to seeing you, even if it's just for a few minutes. You're strong and kind and beautiful, and you make me want to be better than I am. I don't expect anything from you, and I'll understand completely if you don't feel the same way. But I had to tell you the truth." For a long moment, Grace just stared at him, her eyes wide and her lips parted in surprise. Jacob braced himself for rejection, already mentally preparing how he'd handle the awkwardness of continuing to live and work in close proximity to someone who didn't return his feelings. Then Grace reached out and took his hand, her fingers threading through his. "Jacob Sawyer, you are the most wonderful man I've ever met," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "When you found me on that trail, I was convinced my life was over. I had no hope, no future, nothing to live for, but you gave me all of that back. You gave me purpose with this job and safety with the Morrisons. But more than that, you gave me devotion. Every kindness you've shown me, every conversation we've had, every time you've looked at me like I matter, that's been devotion. And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you too." Jacob felt like his chest might burst with the joy flooding through him. "You mean that?" "Truly, truly," Grace confirmed, and then she was leaning toward him and he was leaning toward her, and their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jacob rested his forehead against Grace's and smiled. "I'm going to court you properly," he said. "We'll do this right. I'll ask Henry's permission to take you on walks and to the town's social dances. We'll take our time and get to know each other even better. And when we're both ready, I'll ask you to marry me the way you deserve, not with empty promises but with absolute certainty." "That sounds perfect," Grace whispered and kissed him again. True to his word, Jacob courted Grace with old-fashioned propriety over the following months. He asked Henry's permission to call on her formally, which Henry granted with a knowing smile and Alina's enthusiastic blessing. They took long walks around the ranch property, talking about everything and nothing. Jacob taught Grace to ride better, and she taught him some of the poetry she'd memorized in school. They attended the harvest dance in Cody together, where Jacob proudly introduced Grace to everyone as the woman he was courting, and they danced until their feet hurt. Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy in October, and Grace proved invaluable in helping care for both mother and child during the difficult first weeks. Jacob watched her with the baby, saw the natural tenderness she showed, and found himself imagining her with their own children someday. Winter came to Wyoming with its usual fierce intensity, blanketing the ranch in snow and making outdoor work brutally difficult. But the cold weather meant more time spent inside, and Jacob found himself invited to family dinners at the main house more often, sitting next to Grace at the table, their legs touching underneath, while they tried to maintain proper decorum above it. One evening in early December, as they sat in the parlor after dinner with the rest of the Morrison family, Henry cleared his throat meaningfully and said, "Eleanor, Sarah, why don't we go check on the baby?" The women exchanged amused glances but complied, leaving Jacob and Grace alone. Jacob understood what Henry was offering, this time for a serious conversation without the whole family present. His palms were sweating as he stood and walked over to where Grace sat on the sofa, then knelt down on one knee in front of her. Grace's eyes went wide, her hand flying to her mouth. "Grace Campbell," Jacob began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "These past few months have been the happiest of my life. You're everything I never knew I was looking for. You're strong but gentle, independent but loving, practical but romantic. You make me laugh, you challenge me to be better, and you make every day brighter just by being in it. I know I'm just a cowhand without much to my name, but I work hard and I'll always provide for you the best I can. I promise to love you faithfully, to respect you always, and to be the kind of husband you deserve. Will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Grace's face, but she was smiling wider than Jacob had ever seen. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Jacob, I'll marry you. I love you so much." Jacob pulled a small wooden box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small garnet stone. "It's not much," he said apologetically, "but I've been saving my wages, and I wanted to get you something real, something that would last." "It's perfect," Grace said as he slipped it onto her finger. "Everything about this is perfect." They were married on a cold but sunny day in late December at the small church in Cody. Eleanor and Sarah had helped Grace sew a beautiful white dress, and the whole Morrison family attended, along with most of the ranch hands and half the town. Grace walked down the aisle on Henry's arm, since her own father was back in Ohio, and Jacob thought she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The ceremony was simple, but heartfelt. Jacob repeated his vows with absolute conviction, promising to love and cherish Grace for the rest of his life. When Grace said her vows, her voice was strong and clear. No longer the broken, sobbing woman he'd found on the trail, but a confident woman who knew her own worth and had found someone who recognized it. They kissed to seal their marriage, and the church erupted in cheers and applause. The reception was held at the ranch, with Eleanor and several town women providing enough food to feed an army. There was music and dancing and laughter, and Jacob couldn't remember ever being happier. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Henry pulled Jacob aside. "I have a wedding present for you and Grace," he said. "You remember that cottage on the eastern edge of the property? The one near the creek?" Jacob nodded. It was a small two-room cabin that had been built years ago but sat empty now. "It's yours," Henry said. "Consider it partial payment for all your years of loyal service. I'm raising your wages too. You're not just a hired hand anymore, Jacob. You're family. And family takes care of each other." Jacob was overwhelmed, struggling to find words adequate to express his gratitude. "Henry, I don't know what to say. This is too much." "It's not nearly enough," Henry replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "You're a good man and you've found yourself a good woman. You deserve a proper home to start your life together. Now go on and get your bride. Start your honeymoon right." The cottage was small but cozy, and Eleanor and Sarah had spent the day preparing it for the newlyweds. There were fresh linens on the bed, wood stacked by the fireplace, and even some food in the small kitchen area. Grace gasped with delight when Jacob carried her over the threshold, looking around at what was now their home. "I can't believe this is really ours," she said, turning in a circle to take it all in. "Our own place. A real home." Jacob set her down gently and pulled her into his arms. "The first of many good things to come," he promised. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making you happy, Grace Sawyer. Grace smiled up at him, her eyes shining with love and joy. You already have, she said. You gave me back my life when I thought it was over. You gave me purpose and devotion and love. You're everything I ever wanted and more than I knew I needed. They made love that night for the first time as husband and wife, tender and passionate by turns, learning each other's bodies and hearts. Afterward, they lay tangled together in front of the fire, talking quietly about their dreams for the future. The winter passed in a blur of happiness. Jacob continued his work on the ranch, but coming home each evening to Grace and the cottage felt miraculous every single time. She made the small space feel like a real home, sewing curtains for the windows, cooking meals that filled the air with delicious smells, and greeting him each evening with a kiss that made all the day's hard work worthwhile. In February, Grace came to him with news that filled him with equal parts joy and terror. She was pregnant. They were going to have a baby. "Are you happy?" she asked, watching his face anxiously. "I know we haven't been married very long, but I'm so happy, Jacob. I want this baby so much." Jacob swept her up in his arms, laughing and spinning her around carefully. "Happy, Grace, I'm ecstatic. Terrified, but ecstatic. We're going to be parents." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, with Grace remaining healthy and strong throughout. She continued helping Alina and Sarah with lighter duties even as her belly grew, refusing to be idle. Jacob found himself constantly amazed by her strength and determination. Their son was born on a warm evening in September, almost exactly a year after Jacob had first told Grace he loved her. The birth was attended by Alina and the town doctor, and it was the longest, most terrifying hours of Jacob's life as he paced outside the cottage, listening to Grace's cries and feeling completely helpless. But when Alina finally emerged and told him he could come in, all the fear evaporated. Grace lay exhausted but radiant in their bed, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. When Jacob approached, and she pulled back the blanket to show him his son's face, he felt his heart expand in a way he hadn't known was possible. "He's perfect," Jacob whispered, reaching out with one finger to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. The tiny fingers wrapped around his finger instinctively, and Jacob felt tears prick his eyes. "Grace, he's absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Grace asked, looking up at him with love and exhaustion in her eyes. They discussed names throughout the pregnancy but hadn't settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son, Jacob knew exactly what felt right. "James," he said. "James Henry Sawyer. After my father and Henry Morrison, the two men who taught me what it means to be a good father." Grace smiled. "James Henry Sawyer. I love it. Hello, James. Welcome to the world, little one." The first years of James's life were full and busy. Jacob threw himself into being the best father he could be, taking to parenthood with surprising ease. He'd rock James to sleep at night, walk the floor with him when he was fussy, and never complained about the lost sleep or the extra work. Grace flourished as a mother, her natural warmth and patience perfect for caring for their energetic son. The Morrison Ranch continued to prosper, and Jacob's position there grew increasingly important. Henry began training him to eventually take over as foreman, recognizing both his skill and his loyalty. The increased responsibility came with increased wages, allowing Jacob and Grace to slowly improve their cottage, adding a small addition for James's bedroom and updating the kitchen. When James was 3, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news came with less surprise and more pure joy. They felt ready for another child, confident in their ability to provide and care for a growing family. Their daughter was born in the spring, a tiny thing with Grace's green eyes and Jacob's dark hair. They named her Emily Margaret, after both their mothers. James was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to help care for her, and Jacob loved watching his children together. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch work was hard but satisfying. The family they were building was everything Jacob had ever wanted, and his love for Grace only deepened with each passing year. They weathered the inevitable storms that came with ranching life. Harsh winters, dry summers, occasional cattle losses, and the simple struggles of raising children. But through it all, they had each other. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jacob and Grace stood together on the porch of their cottage, watching James and Emily play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains. Grace leaned against his side, and Jacob wrapped his arm around her shoulders, marveling at how right this all felt. "Do you ever think about that day on the trail?" Grace asked quietly. "The day you found me, sometimes," Jacob admitted. "Usually when I'm feeling particularly grateful for my life." "I think about it a lot," Grace said. "I think about how lost I was, how hopeless everything seemed. And I think about how one moment, one person's kindness can change everything. You didn't have to stop that day. You could have just ridden past, minded your own business. But you stopped, and you helped me, and you gave me a life I never could have imagined." Jacob turned to look at her, cupping her face in his hands. "You gave me just as much, Grace. Maybe more. You taught me to trust again, to open my heart again. You gave me a family and a purpose beyond just existing day to day. We saved each other that day." "We did," Grace agreed, reaching up to cover his hands with hers. "And we've built something beautiful together. I love you, Jacob Sawyer, more now than even the day we married." "I love you too," Jacob said, kissing her softly. "Today, tomorrow, and every day after, you're my home, Grace. You always will be." As the years continued to pass, Jacob and Grace's family grew to include 2 more children, another boy they named Thomas after Grace's father, and a final daughter named Lucy. Their cottage was eventually replaced by a larger house, built with Jacob's own hands with help from his sons as they grew old enough to swing a hammer. James grew into a fine young man, taking to ranch work naturally, and showing the same strong work ethic as his father. Emily had her mother's kind heart and her father's determination, eventually becoming a teacher in Cody. Thomas was the quieter one, more interested in books and learning, though he could handle ranch work when needed. Lucy was the baby, spirited and adventurous, keeping everyone on their toes. Henry and Alina grew older gracefully, eventually stepping back fully and leaving the ranch in Jacob's capable hands. Sarah's son grew up alongside Jacob and Grace's children, the families intertwined in bonds of friendship and love. Jacob never forgot that morning on the trail when he'd found Grace sobbing and broken. It remained a touchstone for him, a reminder of how fragile life could be and how important it was to extend kindness whenever possible. He told the story often to his children, wanting them to understand that their lives, the family they were part of, had begun with an act of simple human compassion. Grace continued to thrive, her early trauma a distant memory replaced by years of love and stability. She ran their household with efficiency and warmth, was beloved in the community for her generous heart, and remained Jacob's closest friend and greatest love. The scared, abandoned woman on the trail had transformed into a confident, capable woman who knew her worth and her place in the world. On the evening of their 30th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration. Their children, now grown with families of their own, filled the house with noise and laughter. Grandchildren ran underfoot, the youngest barely walking while the oldest was already 12. The long table was laden with food, and the sound of joy echoed off the walls. After dinner, as the party continued around them, Jacob pulled Grace outside onto the porch, needing a moment alone with her. The Wyoming sky was ablaze with stars, countless pinpricks of light against the velvety darkness. 30 years, Grace said wonderingly, leaning against the porch railing beside him. Sometimes it feels like we just met, and sometimes it feels like we've been together forever. Both are true, Jacob said, taking her hand and threading his fingers through hers, his thumb rubbing over her wedding ring, now worn smooth by 3 decades of wear. My heart still skips when I see you, same as it did that first day. But I also can't remember a time when you weren't the center of my world. Grace turned to look at him, and in the light spilling from the windows, Jacob could see the lines time had etched on her face, the silver threading through her dark hair. She was 52 now, and he was 62, their youth behind them. But to him, she was every bit as beautiful as she'd been at 22. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" Grace said softly. "The best life," Jacob confirmed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. 4 children, 8 grandchildren so far, a home, work I love, and you beside me through all of it. What more could any man ask for?" From inside the house came the sound of their youngest grandson crying, quickly soothed by his mother's voice. The sound of their family, their legacy, filled Jacob with deep contentment. "You have any regrets?" Grace asked, the question serious despite the celebration happening around them. Jacob thought about it carefully, wanting to give her an honest answer. "No major ones," he said finally. "Sure, there are things I might have done differently in small ways. Times I was too harsh with the children or spent too many hours working when I should have been home. But the big things, the important things, no regrets at all. Especially not about stopping to help a woman crying on a trail 31 years ago." Grace smiled, blinking back tears. 31 years ago, I thought my life was over. I couldn't see any path forward, any reason to keep going. I was so lost, Jacob, and you found me. You didn't just save my life that day, you gave me a reason to live it. You gave me purpose and devotion and love, and I've tried every day since to be worthy of those gifts. Jacob turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Grace Sawyer, you've been more than worthy. You've been extraordinary. You've been my partner, my lover, my best friend, the mother of my children, and the love of my life. Every single day with you has been a gift." They stood there together in the starlight, holding hands and listening to the sound of their family's laughter drifting out from the house. 3 decades of marriage, of building a life together from nothing but hope and determination and love. It hadn't always been easy. They'd weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, faced hardships and heartbreaks. But they'd faced them together, and that had made all the difference. "Come on," Grace said finally, tugging on his hands. "Our family is waiting. Let's go back inside." "In a minute," Jacob said, pulling her close for a kiss. It was tender and sweet, flavored with 30 years of history and still carrying the spark of passion that had first brought them together. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "I love you, Grace," Jacob said. "I love you too, Jacob," Grace replied. "Today, tomorrow, and always." They walked back inside hand in hand, back to the noise and warmth and love of the family they'd created together. Children and grandchildren surrounded them, pulling them into conversations and hugs, the evening continuing in a blur of happiness. Later that night, after everyone had finally gone home or to bed, Jacob and Grace lay together in the darkness of their room. Grace's head rested on Jacob's shoulder, his arm around her, their bodies fitting together with the ease of long practice. "Jacob," Grace said softly, "thank you for everything. For 30 years of love and partnership, for our children and grandchildren, for building this life with me." Thank you for being exactly the man I needed you to be." Jacob pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Thank you for giving me the chance to be that man. Thank you for trusting me when you had every reason not to trust any man. Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to marry me. Thank you for 30 years of love and laughter and joy." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that whatever years they had left would be spent together, facing them side by side as they always had. The ranch continued to prosper under Jacob's leadership, and he eventually began training James to take over, wanting to ensure the Morrison legacy continued into the next generation. Grace remained active in the community, helping with the church, and always ready to lend a hand to anyone in need. Her own experience of receiving kindness in her darkest hour had taught her the importance of extending that same kindness to others. As they moved into their 70s, Jacob and Grace began to slow down, content to let the younger generation shoulder more of the work while they enjoyed the fruits of their decades of labor. They spent their days in simple pleasures, sitting together on the porch watching the sunset, playing with their grandchildren, taking slow walks around the property that had been their home for so long. Their love, rather than fading with time, only seemed to deepen. They'd weathered every storm together, celebrated every joy together, and built something lasting and true. The scared, abandoned woman and the lonely cowboy who'd stopped to help her had become pillars of their community, examples of what true partnership and devotion looked like. On a warm summer evening when Jacob was 75 and Grace was 65, they sat together on their porch as they'd done thousands of times before. The ranch spread out before them, golden in the setting sun. In the distance, they could see James working with some of the hands, their grandson beside him learning the ropes. Emily's children were playing in the yard of her house in town, visible through the trees. Thomas had become a lawyer and lived in Cheyenne, but visited often with his wife and children. Lucy had married a rancher from the neighboring spread, and their children rode over frequently to visit. "We did good, didn't we?" Grace said, her voice carrying the slight tremor of age but still strong at its core. Jacob looked at the scene before them, at the legacy they'd built together, and nodded. "We did better than good. We built something that's going to last long after we're gone. Our children, their children, all of them know what it means to work hard and love hard. They know the value of family and community. They know that kindness matters. That's all because of what we taught them together." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, and Jacob rested his cheek against her silver hair. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear their daughter-in-law preparing dinner, the sound of their youngest grandchildren playing. "I never imagined this," Grace said softly. "That day on the trail when everything seemed lost, I never could have imagined this life, this happiness. All because one good man chose to stop and help. And one strong woman chose to accept that help and build something beautiful with it," Jacob added. "We were both lost in different ways when we found each other, Grace, and we both found our way home together." As darkness fell and the stars began to emerge in the vast Wyoming sky, Jacob and Grace remained on the porch, two souls who'd found each other in the wilderness and chosen to walk the rest of life's journey side by side. Their story, which had begun with tears on a dusty trail, had become a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of devotion, and the enduring nature of true love. Years later, when Jacob was 80 and Grace 70, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by their enormous extended family. 4 children, 14 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren filled the ranch, multiple generations of the family they'd created together. The celebration lasted all day, filled with stories and laughter and love. That evening, as the party wound down, Jacob and Grace found themselves once again on their porch, the place they'd shared so many significant moments over the decades. Grace was moving more slowly now, arthritis making her joints ache, and Jacob's once strong back was bent with age. But their hands still fit together perfectly, their love still burned bright. 50 years, Grace marveled. Half a century of marriage, can you believe it? Some days no, Jacob admitted with a smile. Some days it feels impossible that we've been blessed with so much time together. Other days, it feels like we've always been together, like there was never a time when you weren't part of me. That's how I feel too, Grace said. You're so much a part of me now that I can't remember who I was before you. That scared girl on the trail feels like a different person entirely. She wasn't a different person, Jacob said gently. She was you, just at the beginning of your story instead of near the end. And what a story it's been, my love. What an absolutely beautiful story. They sat together as the stars emerged one by one, as they'd done countless times before. The ranch was quiet now, most of the family having gone home, their children and grandchildren off to their own lives, but always connected by the bonds they'd forged here. I hope when I die, it's here, Grace said suddenly, her voice peaceful rather than morbid. On this ranch in our home with you beside me, I don't want to be anywhere else. Jacob squeezed her hand, understanding the sentiment completely. Me too, this place has been good to us. It's where we built our life, raised our children. It feels right to end our journey here. They went inside eventually, preparing for bed with the ease of long routine. They'd slept beside each other for 50 years, their bodies fitting together even as they'd changed with age. That night, as every night, they fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, secure in their love and the life they'd built together. Jacob lived to see 83, finally succumbing to pneumonia one cold winter night. Grace was beside him at the end, holding his hand and telling him over and over that she loved him, that he'd given her the most beautiful life imaginable. His last words were, "I love you," and his eyes remained on her face until they closed for the final time. Grace mourned deeply, but not bitterly. She'd had 53 years with the love of her life, had built a family and a legacy that would continue long after they were both gone. She lived 3 more years after Jacob's death, remaining in their home and surrounded by family who made sure she was never alone. When Grace finally passed, peacefully in her sleep at age 76, she was buried beside Jacob in the small cemetery on the edge of the ranch property. Their children commissioned a single headstone for both of them, engraved with their names, dates, and a simple epitaph. 2 souls who found each other in the wilderness and walked home together. The story of Jacob and Grace became family legend, passed down through the generations. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually hear about the lonely cowboy who'd stopped to help a sobbing woman on a trail. How that single act of kindness had blossomed into a love that spanned more than half a century. The ranch they'd built together continued to prosper, remaining in the family through multiple generations. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun painted the mountains gold and purple, family members swore they could feel Jacob and Grace's presence on the porch of the old house, 2 spirits still keeping watch over the legacy they'd created. Whether that was true or simply the result of wishful thinking, it didn't really matter. Because their love, their devotion, their story that was real, and it would endure as long as the mountains stood and the wind blew across the Wyoming plains. The ranch that had given Grace purpose and received Jacob's devotion became a symbol of what could be built when 2 broken people chose to heal together, to love despite past hurts, to build rather than to fear. Every generation that came after them carried that lesson forward, understanding that family wasn't just about blood, but about the choice to stand beside someone through whatever came. And it had all started with one cowboy who chose to stop and help, and one woman brave enough to accept that help and build something beautiful from the ashes of her broken dreams. Their story was proof that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just the beginning of the best chapters, that redemption is always possible, and that true love, once found, can weather any storm and last beyond a lifetime.